Very difficult to know where to start with this one. We've got to start with George Russell, really. Standing in for Lewis Hamilton, jumping into the Mercedes from the Williams. At least he's used to the power unit, I guess you could say that. He was absolutely brilliant on Friday, quickest in both sessions. He was almost there in qualifying. Valtteri took the pole, but he helped Mercedes to yet another front row lockout. And he was great off the line, took the lead into the first corner and pulled away because Valtteri, well, we'll get on to Valtteri in a minute, just basically held everybody else up for the first couple of corners and allowed George just to get away. After that, he controlled the pace of the race with absolute perfection. Never allowed Valtteri to get within 3 seconds or so, came in at exactly the right moment, looked after his tyres, did everything correctly. But then, as is often the case when it's a sort of weird race and things are not quite right and it's a short circuit lap and Lewis Hamilton's not there and weird things are happening, it all went wrong. It all went wrong when, interestingly, ironically, George's sparring partner from the ART GP3 and Formula 2 days, Jack Aitken at ART, hit the wall coming out of the last corner. Sort of Alex Albon type overcorrection on when he'd lost grip. Not a great looking lose at all. Took the nose off the car, but much more importantly, damaged part of the guardrail, which meant that they put out a virtual safety car. And at this moment, both Mercs came in for a stacked pit stop. Never a nice thing for the team. And if you want to jump on the bandwagon now and say Mercedes completely blew it for George Russell, this is your moment. Me, I say, well, you know, been there, done that. I know what it's like for teams. Massive pressure, particularly when it's a stacked pit stop and you're not really expecting it. Anyway, tyre mix up on George's car. They got a mix set, which meant they had to bring him in again to correct that. So he basically had 2 pit stops. Meanwhile, when Valtteri pulled up, massive problem with the left front. And the result of that, when they both re-emerged midfield, Valtteri just with the 1 stop, but a really long stop, Valtteri was just ahead, but he was on a set of hards, whereas George was on a set of mediums. He quickly breezed past Valtteri, who sunk like a stone. But nonetheless, George absolutely stunning yet again, closing in on Sergio Perez with about 8 laps to go. He was closing in at about 0.3 of a second a lap. He got the gap down to about 5 seconds. It was going to be really close, but there was a chance Sergio was going to be able to hold on to his lead, and we'll get on to Sergio in a minute as well. But just as that was about to unfold, George got a punctured left rear. And they had to say on the radio, it is a genuine puncture, George. You've got to come in, because he just did not want to come in. He probably felt the balance going away a little bit, but he, being George Russell, was going to live with that. So he dropped down the field. He finished just behind Valtteri, 8th and 9th in the end for Mercedes. I suppose you have to finish this by saying Lewis Hamilton, wherever he was in quarantine, would have been thinking, not sure I wanted to be a part of any of this today. But for George Russell, it was a sensational Sakhir Grand Prix. It's going to be really difficult for him to get back into the Williams again. Well, will it be? I don't know. He'll get in and he'll think, well, you know, I've touched the sky. I've proved how good I am. Yeah, I'm in a Williams now, but for sure my career is going to go rapidly upwards from here. It was not a good day for Valtteri Bottas. As I say, let's just talk about that. Valtteri was on the pole, but he was outgunned into the first corner on the dirty side of the road by George, who, let's face it, hasn't got a lot of experience at starting a factory Mercedes off the line, but he was really, really good. Typical George Russell, aggressive and just right in there, tucking the nose of the car in. Valtteri didn't really know what had happened by the look of it. He went back into the mode he'd been in on Friday when he was making lots of mistakes and he was a bit stunned by how quick George was. Saturday, we should say, it was the old Valtteri Bottas. The Valtteri Bottas we haven't seen many times this year, but he was really, really good on Saturday. But Sunday, all it took was that first corner, and he was like, whoa, what's going on here? Anyway, Valtteri coming out of turn 2, which is the sort of next left, lost the rear, and almost lost it. I mean, he held it quite well, but as a result of that, there was a stack of cars right next to him. Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc, particularly Sergio Perez too, all banked up behind him as they headed on the straight down to turn 4. By now, George had disappeared. And Valtteri, of course, being in the factory Merc, did have the edge in straight line speed. So it was a really uncomfortable situation as they approached the braking area for turn 4, with Valtteri sort of artificially quick based on how slow he'd been, if you get my meaning, coming out of turn 3. Anyway, there they were. Max did a good job, Sergio did a good job, but Charles in the Ferrari, who had a real chance today, locked up, misjudged his braking, took out Max Verstappen. Well, Max ran wide and then tried to get back on the track. He'd been brushed slightly, but then just went off into the tyre barrier, and that was it, wrecked the front of the Red Bull. Charles also went off, so they were out immediately from the Sakhir Grand Prix. And Sergio Perez looked as if he was out as well, because the front of the Racing Point was damaged. He had to come into the pit. They put on a new nose and they set him out on a new set of tyres. And he was down in 18th place, back of the field. Never really thought about where he would be then towards the end of the race. But as it went on, because he'd been really good in his tyre management, and here there is a point to be made about the strategy, because I've been saying over the last 2 days that the tyre deg on this outer circuit isn't as ferocious, isn't as great as it had been in the week before. Yet some of the teams, and indeed the Pirelli predictions, were saying, 2-3 stop strategy potentially. And yet I was actually talking to one of the Racing Point engineers earlier in the week, and he said, no, this looks like a race where we could certainly do a strong first stint. And I had made the point as well in the last 3 or 4 videos, how well Sergio Perez is driving at the moment and how good he looked, certainly last weekend, and then in the build-up to this race as well. I think I used the phrase, he's got this ribbon of track that he's really, really good on. And when this race started, it was 8 o'clock at night, local time. There was quite a strong wind. There was quite a lot of sand and dust blowing around. And it was always my feeling, and you can look at my WhatsApps to see if it's true, but it was always my feeling with some friends that Sergio was going to be in really good shape today, because he's so good with the back end of the car and managing the tyres and just feeding on the power at exactly the right rate. And that's what he did. On his next set of tyres, he did lock up, and he had a lot of pressure at one point from Alex Albon, and that was slightly worrying, but then that went away, and from there on the next set of tyres, the car, the balance, and Sergio's driving was just superb to watch. And that was what won him the Grand Prix. That was what kept him together under pressure when George Russell was closing on him. Obviously, when George was out and had to go in for that final puncture, it then became just a matter of bringing the car home, because the next runner was, and he drove really well, and we've been saying that since Friday as well, as Esteban Ocon, how good he looked in the Renault. He drove a really good, clean race. So it was interesting to see that the first 3 were all, and Lance Stroll finished 3rd for Racing Point. It was interesting to see how well that 2-stop strategy played for the likes of the 2 Racing Points and for Esteban Ocon. There was a lot of midfield scurrying around 2-3 stop, and it was very close at the end. The number of cars lined up behind Esteban as they crossed the line, it was like right down to 10th place. But the nice thing about this race is that the 2-stop strategy was rewarded. In other words, good tyre management was rewarded. And they gained, of course, track position when the 3-stoppers came in during virtual safety cars or at other moments. Sebastian Vettel was nowhere again, so it was a dreadful day for Ferrari, with Charles out on the first lap and Sebastian finishing, 12th. Alex Albon finished 6th for Red Bull. You'd have to think really in that car it should have been a better result for him. Daniel Ricciardo was 5th. On this occasion, his strategy didn't work out as well as Esteban Ocon. There were a couple of moments when Daniel was brought in at just the wrong moment. In other words, he'd crossed the line by the time they'd said box, but it didn't make that much difference to his running. Danny Kvyat finished 7th, kind of there all day, but not quite where he should have been at the end of the race, I think. Again, the strategy of running 3 stops against the 2-stoppers, say, and Esteban Ocon, was shown up. Valtteri Bottas and George Russell eventually finished 8th and 9th for Mercedes. I've got to repeat that, 8th and 9th for Mercedes. Isn't it interesting? I had a couple of messages from mates during the race who know that I respect Lewis's talent, saying, this just shows that Lewis Hamilton's nothing special at all. A young guy like George Russell can just jump in the car. He's not familiar with it at all. He can just blow everybody away. It's obviously a great car, and look how Valtteri looks alongside George, so he obviously hasn't been giving Lewis a hard time. Well, of course, it's very easy to say all that. I don't buy any of it, because I think George is really, really good. I've been saying that, ever since I was interviewing him in the GP3 days. I remember chatting to George, actually it was at Abu Dhabi, when he was racing GP3 and testing Formula One for Force India, interestingly, ironically, at the same time. And not many drivers had done that. And he was just so matter of fact about it. GP3 to F1 in the same day, no problem whatsoever. Yeah, and I remember thinking then, this guy is so cool. He's such a great racing driver, and he's such a great bloke as well. There were 2 good moments, I suppose, that you'll have to look back and smile with. One was in his first pit stop, when Bono got on the radio and said to him, remember, George, we're at the beginning of the pit lane. In other words, don't go down to the Williams pit. And the other moment was when they'd made the mess with the pit stops, and he was out there with mediums, and they said, well, George, you're going to have good grip on these tyres. And he said, well, I bloody well hope I do after that. He's just such a natural guy, and I just, of course, you have to feel so sorry for him. But equally, you have to say, this was a great weekend for George Russell because he showed everybody how good he was. And Lewis Hamilton, of course, would have been thinking, wow, this guy is seriously good, because Lewis knows that no race car is perfect, no race car is easy to drive. And don't forget this point as well. If the Mercedes, particularly the number 44 or 63 Mercedes, whatever you want to call it, is a great car, it's a great car because the amount of work that's been going into making it like that. And Lewis Hamilton should take a lot of the credit for that. So, yeah, you can't say that this in any way shows up Lewis. But what you can say is that George Russell is a potential, well, we knew he was a potential world champion anyway, but he's the world champion. He's got his path clearly defined. Two other little ironies, I think. One was that the F2 race today was won by the very fast and talented Indian, Jahan Darubala. It was a Carlin 1-2. So congratulations to Trevor Carlin. Congratulations to Mick Schumacher for clinching and finally winning the Formula 2 championship, and to Prema for winning that, by the way, the team's championship. But we shouldn't forget that Darubala is a product of that team that won the race today. Of course, it was owned then by Vijay Mallya, and it was a Force India initiative, but he was a young Carter when Force India sort of brought him into the fold and showed him a few things and got him racing, and here he is winning F2. So another, in that sense, an even better day for that team. I would like to pay a big tribute to all the engineers, mechanics and management people at Racing Point who have been there, of course, some of them since the Eddie Jordan days, but certainly since the Force India days. And those are the real heart and soul of that team, and what a great job they've done. Lance Stroll, I think, drove pretty well. He didn't get the best of strategies. There was a moment when Sergio was behind him. Lance was sort of, oh, there he is, I'll move to the left to let him pass, and locked up and lost a position to Esteban Ocon at that moment as well. That was a bit scratchy, but at the end of the day, you got to say, and I have to confess here that I've always been a bit wary of the whole Stroll thing, because I'm always a bit wary of, people with that amount of power and money, I suppose. But I've always been a little bit wary of it. But everything that they're doing and have done is kind of blue chip, isn't it? Their time with Prema, and they still own Prema, I think, the Strolls, or not certainly a large percentage of Prema. And what they're doing now. Sergio, the only thing you got to say is that here is Sergio Perez. He's just won his first Grand Prix, very deserved. And he was really good throughout the day, from 18th on the first lap. And he's just been fired. It's like Nico Hülkenberg getting the pole in Brazil, when Tom McCullough was his race engineer at Williams and getting fired. And here's Tom McCullough, who's, I think his title is Chief Performance Engineer at Racing Point. They've just brought Sergio Perez his first Grand Prix win, and there's Sergio about to get fired. It's a kind of a weird thing. And of all the drivers on the grid at the moment, let's put aside the background, the history, the heritage, and what they may or may not bring to the team in terms of star value. You'd have to say that Sebastian Vettel isn't the first name that would jump out at you. George Russell maybe would be another. But they're replacing Sergio with Sebastian Vettel. Now, okay, maybe Sebastian would have won that race today. Probably he would have won it. And I've always said Sergio's ability to get the power down in that linear, beautiful way is very, very unusual. And it's in my mind, he stood out because of that as a racing driver for many years. But he's massively improved over the last couple of years under the management of, I think, the driver coaching management of Tom McCullough. And we saw that in Turkey in the wet. We saw how good Sergio Perez was in the wet. Now, before Turkey, if you wanted to draw up a list of great wet weather drivers in Formula One, would you have included Sergio Perez? I wouldn't have. But there he was, doing a really, really good job. And I think that's an indication of how good Sergio is now. And then we had the wind, and we had the sand and the dust, and we had pressure, and we had tyre management, and we had coming through from 18th place. And the guy wins the Sakhir Grand Prix. That is very impressive. Lots of stats. Yeah, Pedro Rodriguez was the last Mexican to win a Grand Prix. He won the 1970 Belgian Grand Prix at Spa for BRM. Of course, he had won the 67 South African Grand Prix as well for Cooper, when Ron Dennis was his mechanic. But anyway, that's kind of in the past. The story today is of a Mexican who has won his first Grand Prix from 18th on the first lap, and of George Russell, a young Englishman who jumped into Lewis Hamilton's car, looked like Lewis Hamilton for most of the day, and then didn't win the race, a race that should have been his, because of a mix-up during a tyre pit stop and then a puncture. Something as banal as that. What we do know now is how good George is.